Hey guys, how you going? This is Billyeatworld again, and thanks for taking the time to check out another episode of Battlefield 5 Real History. Just remember though, if you do like what you see, make sure to hit subscribe and most importantly the bell icon, and also feel free to leave a suggestion in the comments for what you want to see in the next video. Now, in today's episode, we're actually going to take a look at the real history of the Twisted Steel and Arras maps in Battlefield 5, or in other words, the Battle of France. And as you might have noticed, this is actually going to be a two-part episode because I don't really want to get into those specific battles before I explain the wider campaign a little bit more. So in this part, we're mainly just going to focus on the French and Belgian involvement, and in the next one, well, we'll get into the role of the British. And of course, we're going to talk about the Germans, because after all, this was their plan known as Fall Gelb, or in other words, Operation Case Yellow. Okay, so to kick off, just to bring you up to speed, well, when the Battle of France kicked off, World War II was well underway, and Germany had already occupied a number of European countries. Most importantly, though, it had already conquered Poland, and it was well on its way to conquering Norway as well, which you can find out about in my previous episode on the Battle of Narvik. As you'll find out, both of these countries fell pretty quickly because they were largely unprepared, but France, on the other hand, well, that was a different story. Because firstly, it had always been one of the great European powers, and secondly, the French knew Germany's population was on the rise, and they'd need to make up for this in any future conflict. If any single event shaped France's view on 20th century warfare, though, it was clearly the Battle of Verdun during the First World War. And one of the things they learned from that battle was that well-defended fortresses, like Fort Vaux for example, were a very effective way of evening the odds. Bearing that in mind, in the early 1930s, the French government adopted a new defensive strategy that involved building a giant line of fortresses called the Maginot Line along their German border. And to the northwest of that lay the impenetrable Ardennes forest, and further along again, the country of Belgium, which had been a strong ally of France since at least the First World War. Now, if and when a war did break out, the French plan was to hold out along the Maginot Line while their army to the north would push into Belgium to reinforce the border there. Except the problem was, in 1936, King Leopold III of Belgium had the bright idea to renegotiate their foreign relations policy, clearly in what he thought was in the interests of his own country. Belgium would go back to a position of neutrality in the hopes that Germany would leave it alone, which in turn meant that they weren't able to coordinate a defensive strategy with France. And so when the invasion did come in May 1940, French forces just weren't in a position along the Belgians' eastern border to hold the Germans back. Also, as it turned out, the Ardennes forest didn't end up being quite as impenetrable as the French first thought, because they'd made that estimation from their experience in World War I. But by 1940, turns out the technology of mechanised warfare had come far enough that the German tanks were able to just barely pass through it after all. The problem was, though, is that even though Allied reconnaissance aircraft did spot the German tanks advancing through the forest, the French commanders just didn't believe it was possible. And so when the German Panzer Corps, led by the now famous General Heinz Guderian, smashed into the French countryside, well, there wasn't anything to hold them back. Now, the funny thing about the Maginot Line is that if it had have functioned as intended, it probably would have worked or at least helped out a lot. But during the interwar years, the fact is, it's obvious from hindsight that France was preparing to fight the last war, while the Germans were preparing to fight the next one. If France's plan all along was to defend its borders, then Germany knew the French heartland would be largely undefended, and that by pushing through, it could divide their forces. And so in the previous decade, Germany had been developing new tanks, aircraft and other vehicles for a military doctrine that had come to be known as Blitzkrieg, or the Lightning War. Also, it's worth mentioning, if you know anything else about World War II history, you'd probably know that much is said about the superiority of German technology, especially when it comes to tanks. But the fact is, in this early period in the war, the bulk of the German armoured forces weren't superior at all, consisting of smaller tanks that couldn't penetrate the heavier French tanks like the Char B1. Not just that, but most people don't realise the French actually outnumbered the Germans in the Battle of France, in particular when it came to tanks and artillery. But at the end of the day, it just turned out that that didn't matter, because whereas the French tanks were built to move slowly and support infantry, the German tanks were organised to operate together in much more effective armoured spearheads. So all in all, in what was thought should have been a long and prolonged World War I style campaign, the French and Belgians were forced to fight in less than ideal places, like for example Arras and the River Escaut. And as we'll find out in the next episode, this is where Great Britain comes into the story, as the BEF, their small but well-trained professional army, was stationed in France when the battle broke out. Despite this though, the Germans still managed to overwhelm the Allied forces, and by late June 1940 the British had evacuated and the majority of the French army were prisoners of war. And in addition to this, if you're thinking that things couldn't get any worse for the Allies, well, they also picked up another enemy as well, because the puppet Vichy government Germany installed in France would go on to fight alongside the Axis powers. As bad as the situation was, though, with the help of the British, the Free French did manage to put together a roughly organised resistance called the Marquis. But ultimately, although they did help a little bit with intelligence gathering and the rescue of Allied POWs, they were never really in a position to attempt to retake the country. It wouldn't actually be until 4 long years later, in June 1944, that the French would have a chance to fight the Germans again, when the Allies invaded Hitler's fortress Europe. And, well, the rest is history. By August, the Allies had retaken Paris, and in December, ironically once again in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge would put an end to Germany's aggression in the West. But anyway, guys, I guess that just about wraps up this video, so make sure you let me know what you think of Twisted Steel and Arras in the comment section below. And also just remember, in the next video, we're going to be checking out the specific history of these battles themselves, so make sure you stay tuned for that. As always, though, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and please feel free to check out the links in the description if you want to see any more of these videos. And also, don't forget, you can find my Twitter and Discord links down there as well if you want to keep in touch. And as always, until next time, see you later, and have a good one.